Welcome to Conceived in Liberty, the Bradley Speaker Series. I'm Rick Graber, president of the Bradley Foundation. And on behalf of our entire team at Bradley, thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope that you and your families continue to be safe and healthy. Every spring for the last 16 years, the Bradley Foundation has hosted our Bradley Prizes event, which is a wonderful celebration which recognizes the accomplishments of three outstanding individuals who have truly dedicated their lives and their careers to restoring, strengthening, and protecting the principles and institutions of American exceptionalism. Obviously, we weren't able to host that event this year, but we're really excited to, in its place, offer this series of conversations with former Bradley Prize winners. And there's no person more qualified to talk about the topic of American exceptionalism than our guest today, Dr. Alan Guelzo. Alan is an acclaimed scholar of American history whose writings have been recognized as among the most important contributions to scholarly and public understanding of the 19th century in America. His books about Abraham Lincoln have earned him numerous honors, including 3 Lincoln Prizes. He's the Senior Research Scholar in the Humanities Council at Princeton University, is Director of the James Madison Program's Initiative in Politics and Statesmanship, and is a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's also a 2018 winner of a Bradley Prize. Dr. Guelzo, greetings and welcome.
It's good to be greeted, Rick, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thanks so much. I thought we'd start with this topic of American exceptionalism. It's something that you've written a lot about. How do you think we fared? How do you think the foundations of American exceptionalism have fared during this crisis of the last few months?
Well, in looking at this and living through it and reflecting on earlier crises, some of them epidemic crises, I think we've discovered some pretty extraordinary things about ourselves as Americans. I think, for one thing, we've discovered a lot about our willingness and our patience to go shoulder to shoulder when facing a crisis. I have seen no sense of Americans turning on each other, blaming each other, pointing fingers. I've seen some Americans irritated about government restrictions, and I've seen some Americans irritated about their governors. But that's not a surprise. That's ordinary politics. What I think has been extraordinary is Americans have not turned on each other. They have not blamed each other. To the contrary, they've shown a remarkable degree of sacrifice, willingness to stand even on the front lines of things, and patience to bear with what really is a very taxing time for American individuality. All of those virtues are things that we're sometimes tempted to imagine passed away out of American life a long time ago. No, not on the evidence that I have seen in the last 2 months. Another thing that I think is extraordinary this way is our simply boundless individual economic creativity. I went to do a curbside pickup at a local tea shop. Out in front of that tea shop, there was a table. It had a teapot and a hand sanitizer. And I thought, now there is someone with some real spunk. Just less than a mile away, there was a tailor shop. Big sign in the window. Tailor shop had this window, and in the window was the sign that said, "We make custom-made face masks." In other words, they pivoted. They were making all kinds of tailored goods before. Now they're making face masks, and people were lined up at appropriate social distance, but people were lined up to get up to the front door of this shop and buy these things. And I thought, goodness sakes, there's creativity under conditions of great stress. The kind of thing that's reminiscent, of World War II, of one of those Yorktown moments. When the carrier Yorktown comes limping into Pearl Harbor and they say, well, it's going to take 8 months to replace this. And the order comes down and says, no, you've got 72 hours. And the motto that emerges from it is, the difficult, we do it once. The impossible takes a little longer. That kind of go-aheadedness I have just seen over and over and over again. And in a lot of ways, despite all the stress, that has been one of the most heartening things about it, is to see Americans moving forward as Americans in those remarkable and exceptional ways that set us so much apart.
Indeed. But American exceptionalism has been under attack. And one such example is the New York Times Magazine's so-called 1619 Project, which you recently described as a historical bombshell. Do you think that project undermines the foundations of American exceptionalism?
Well, I think it certainly undermines American exceptionalism as we have understood it, and substitutes, let's call it a substitute exceptionalism, a reverse exceptionalism. The 1619 Project takes as its goal recentering American history and retelling the story of America, not as a story of liberty, not as a story of upwards mobility, but as a story of racial oppression. That's the only story about America. America is a story of racial oppression, A to Z. It's a one solution concept. And in that respect, what it does, it resembles a lot of conspiracy theories. Now, usually conspiracy theories can be very tenacious, but they sooner or later come to be regarded as freaks. And I think this will as well. What 1619 really is a kind of reverse exceptionalism. The exceptionalism, though, in this case, being about how consistently evil America's characteristics have been. Slavery, protection of slavery, racism in dealing with the aftermath of slavery, race as the central theme of American history. Now, I will be the last to dismiss the suffering of African Americans. It is the great national historical disgrace. And conservatives have done far less about it than they should. And no one has wanted more badly to be part of the real American exceptionalism than African Americans, only too often to have the door slammed on their fingers. But the story of African Americans is the story of the promise of American exceptionalism in its most classic form, and how it wins through, even in the face of the most blatant human hypocrisy. The story of African Americans is the story of the most remarkable demonstration of American exceptionalism. It's the kind of thing that's thinkable nowhere else in the world. Its heroes are Frederick Douglass, Sergeant William Carney, Dory Miller, Madam C.J. Walker, Robert Abbott, Harriet Tubman, Jackie Robinson, Jesse Owens, Benjamin O. Davis. These are American heroes, and they are my heroes too, because they carry the banner of American exceptionalism.
Let's turn to leadership during times of crisis. We have the benefit now of well over a century of hindsight, and it seems clear that Abraham Lincoln was perfectly suited to be the leader of the United States during the Civil War.
I'm so glad you said that.
What made him such an effective leader, and what guidance do you think that he would give today's leaders during this crisis?
Well, there are many characteristics about the man himself, internal characteristics, his resilience, his command of the overall machinery of government, his understanding of how the situation worked. Those, in some respects, are things unique to the man himself. He had what is sometimes called the coup of the eye. In other words, he could look at a situation, and where other people would just see the trees, he would see the forest. He would see where the 6 month out, the 18-month out indicators were taking things. And those are not things that are easily replicable. On the other hand, there are some extraordinary things about Lincoln's leadership in the Civil War, which I think do shed some light today. For one thing, I'm always impressed by how much he trusted the American people to meet the crisis of the Civil War. Even in his first inaugural, when he's saying, quite frankly, here are the southern states, they're dissatisfied, they're seceding from the Union. Why do this when the American people themselves have put into place this Constitution with these restraints? Only 4 years for a president. How much damage can I possibly do in 4 years? Why? we trust the American people. And he exhibited that trust in the way that he distributed responsibility during the war. A case in point being the railroads. The railroads during the Civil War are the vital lines of connection between not only parts of the civilian economy, but also between the military front and military operations. He does not nationalize the railroads. This is different from the Confederacy. He does not nationalize the railroads. Instead, he strikes a bargain with the railroads about, well, you'll carry troops and you'll carry military freight at such and such a rate. We'll guarantee this amount, going so forth. He trusts these people, and he trusts the railroads and the civilian people involved in the railroads to carry the war effort forward that way. He consults with state governors. He brings the state governors, and remember, this is a war which is supposed to be on the part of the Confederacy about state rights. Look at the Confederacy. The president of the Confederacy showed no respect whatsoever for state rights during the Civil War. It's Lincoln who shows respect for state rights. It's Lincoln who consults with the state governors. He also respects congressional authority. Now, mind you, he's perfectly willing to do everything he can to influence his options, but he respects congressional authority. And above all, this comes back to his trust of the people. He keeps to the 1864 election schedule. 1864, we're still in the midst of the Civil War. It's not clear, even at that point, what the result of the war is going to be militarily. If Lincoln had said, look, this is a national emergency, we've got to suspend national elections, we just can't be doing this in the middle of a war, there are people who would have objected, but they would have had a hard time making that objection stick because it would have seemed obvious. He never does that. After the election, he says, if we had canceled the elections, that would have been, in effect, giving away the whole governmental argument to the opposition. So he keeps to the 1864 election schedule. He takes the chance. It turns out right for him, and it turns out right for the country. But that's because of his level of trust of the country and the people in that country. COVID is not nearly the threat that a civil war was. But I think those overarching responses that Lincoln demonstrates still resonate with us today, and I think still provide guidance for how leadership can respond in the midst of the coronavirus epidemic.
Terrific. Last question, Alan. Why is it so important for history to tell an accurate story?
Because for Americans, all that we have is our history. You know, Rick, we're not built like some other nations have been built or tried to be built around race or soil or ethnicity or religion or even language. We are built around a historical proposition embedded in a document that's almost 250 years old. We are dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, right at this moment, it feels like an asteroid has hit us and that we're living in the crater, and that history really can't offer a whole lot in the way of direction. But that's not really true. Our history is who we are. Our history is what we're about. When we talk about our history is what gives us our identity. And the importance of our history, I think, is underscored by a comment that Alexander Solzhenitsyn made many years ago, which has always stuck with me. What do tyrants want to do? What's the first thing tyrants want to do when they want to acquire totalitarian control over a people or a culture? They erase their history. Why do they do that? They do it so that people will have no past to compare the present to. And that means that totalitarian rulers can get away with imposing whatever horrors they like in the present because they've erased the past the people might compare it to. For us as Americans, our history is what gives us our identity. That's what we're dedicated to. That is what Lincoln at Gettysburg said we were all about. But even in a larger sense, our history is important because that is what gives us our direction, our sense of freedom, of looking back to a past that helps to direct us to the present.
Dr. Alan Guelzo, thanks so much for joining us today for what were fantastic remarks, fantastic insights. We truly do appreciate it. We hope you've enjoyed it. We'll be joined next time by Victor Davis Hanson, well-known scholar, author, and commentator. And until then, thanks for your continuing interest in Conceived in Liberty, the Bradley Speaker Series.